Bonjour à tous.
Hello, everyone. We will start this first session of the Global Economic Dialogue on the question of the indicators of wealth for nations. I am very happy to be with Victor Luis do Prado, who worked a lot in many responsibility at the WHO and now at the Brazilian Center for International Relations. Next to him, we have Dr. Emmanuel Souzu Sekire, who is from the African Center for Economic Transformation. Next to him, we have Sander Tordoir, who's the chief economist for the Center for European Reform. And finally, our witness, Cyril Garcia, who's a member of the board of Capgemini. Hello, everyone. This session invites us to think about the question of indicators of wealth for nations, and is now for a few years that we've collectively understood that we need to go further the traditional indicators such as GDP per inhabitant. But the real question remains, what are the relevant indicators? From my point of view, there are only two of them that are very important to judge on the future of a country. The first one is indicator of health, and this is the hybrid indicator for health, which is the life expectancy, even if there's some other sub-indicators. And the second part of it is skills. So we have the OECD, who provided us with a number of data on skills of adults coming from various countries. We also have a lot of data on school performance for different countries that are very predictive of the performance at an adult age. So if we look at those two dimensions, health or skills, we can take a step back and we really need to worry. Do we sometimes take enough step back? Yeah, if you take the USA, for example, for male non-white population, you have a stagnation in the progress of life expectancy. This is all the works of Angus Deaton, which showed that because of death by addiction, from opioids, from a lot of mental health problems, we have a drop in the life expectancy for a large group of the population. So when we have a phenomenon like this happening, this is clearly a red flag. Same goes with skills. We recruit a lot in France on people who have skills in math, but this is another red flag that we should worry about. All those ideas that are not taken into account in the calculation of the GDP per inhabitant are often overlooked. Do we want to have a more synthetic indicator? Some works have been done recently, well, not that recently, but a lot of efforts have been made to obtain some satisfaction indicators in life. Sometimes people talk about happiness indicators. It's not really that, but we ask people to evaluate their life from a scale to 1 to 10, and to ask people to do that attracts a lot of different dimensions and gathers a lot of economic, but also non-economic dimension. So the Gallup survey, company does a lot of those in a lot of countries, and the countries that come first on this measure of happiness is always the Scandinavian countries. So this is a very useful indicator. Now there's another aspect. We've made a lot of progress on taking into account these new indicators, but there's one that we haven't really managed to make progress on. It's for all these indicators, at the end of the day, we can classify all the countries. So we list those that are doing well, those are doing not so well, but some aspects for which the classification of countries makes no sense. For example, environment. If you look at the environment, you could be very good reducing your emissions, but if your neighboring countries are very bad and increasing their emissions more than you do the job in reducing them, it amounts to nothing. So in the way we think about the indicators, we also need to make progress in how we imagine the monitoring of all the classification between countries. That is not enough. we need to measure some of all the progress that is being made, and that is much more difficult. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to our speakers. I'm going to start with Victor Luis do Prado, who comes from the Brazilian Center for International Relations, and he had a lot of responsibility at the WHO. Thank you. WTO, sorry. Hello, Alexandra. I'm very happy to be here. Alexandra was talking about the indicators, and I was thinking about the title of these rencontres, to navigate in a world without any milestones. Are the indicators the milestones that we're looking for? In the last years, we kind of lost our compass. Why have we lost our compass? Because of the phenomenon that, curiously, are starting with the letter C. We have COVID, we have climate, we have conflicts, we have value chain, commercial value chain, we have cyber security and cyber and AI, of course. And then, last but not least, we have China that starts also with a C, and I could add much more to the list. All those phenomenon gave us the feeling of trouble, like we don't really know where we're at. And the question remains, in a world that is so uncertain, with so many turbulences, can these indicators help us? And who could they help? All of us? Maybe, to understand the world that we live in. But particularly, they should be helpful to those who make the decisions. And who makes the decision? The governments, to begin with, and the companies. They make decisions that have an impact on us, people. Are these indicators used by the governments to make good decisions? Do we have the right indicators so people can adopt good measures? And here, it is very strange because the governments, very often, they use indicators to justify their own narrative of the reality. So it's a use that is a bit strange, a bit distorted of these indicators. I give you an example, and then I'll make it back to my own experience without talking too much about the wealth of nation, but it has to do with it. Let's talk about international trade. I have in mind this image of the President Donald Trump in April of last year with a blackboard at the White House with all the trade tariffs that he was going to impose on several countries. And what was the reason for which he would increase the tariffs was this trade deficit. For my country, for example, Brazil, it didn't make any sense because the U.S. have a trade excess versus the Brazil. So we already had the highest tariffs in Brazil. So he didn't even use the right indicator. But let's not, let's move on from that. Are these indicators of trade balance, are they the right one? And here we always get to this thought that trade balance is often the reflection of trade of goods, products. And they don't count services, tourism, telecommunications, banks, and all that is left behind. Everything that is pertaining to intellectual property are not counted in this trade balance. Every time we do a download, as we say in French, of a film or a video, or even very often, or a platform of AI, and that doesn't cost a lot of money. That costs a lot of money, sorry. It is not cheap. So we're moving money from one country to the next, and that is not being accounted for. Is it a good indicator? Even if we restrict ourselves to goods, everybody has a cell phone. This cell phone is made of parts. small parts that come from 40 different countries. These parts are crossing borders several times. And at the end of the day, we only take into account the final price. If we were to sum up the price of every part that crosses a border every time, and would make a calculation by added value, the result would be completely different. First of all, the US would not have a deficit versus China. I tell you all that because, once more, I'm afraid that these indicators very often are hiding the truth more than they prove it. So, as Alexandra said, we need to rethink these indicators, to modernize them. And this is not something that economists can do. Everybody talked about GDP. Some people know, I'm sure, among you, index Gini of inequalities. All of those are well known. Can we trust those indicators, or are we completely in a world we don't trust anything anymore? So this is the question. Thank you, Alexandra. Dr. Victor.
Okay, all right. So GDP is, I think the theme of the session lays out the question very clearly. We use economic indicators to measure the wealth of nations, right? Should we continue doing that or not? All right. So GDP, the gross domestic product, stands out as one of the most prominent economic indicators used to measure economic progress. And, since the Great Depression, the 1930s and 1940s, it is a quantitative construct specifically designed to measure the value of the final goods and services produced in the country in a particular year, okay? Sometimes it goes a step further to tell you how much each of the sectors of the economy is contributing: the primary sector, agriculture, forestry, fishing, the middle sector, the intermediate sector, the secondary sector, industry, construction, manufacturing, utilities, etc., and the tertiary sector. Okay, so that's how far it goes, how the sectors are contributing to GDP growth. It is standardized globally. It is easy to replicate statistically, and it helps to compare countries. It's fantastic. The challenge is that it does not capture the full picture of economic progress or the full picture of living standards or the quality of life. Now, this conversation we're having this afternoon happened a long time ago in 1934, when Simon Kuznets said, this indicator is good. It's supposed to measure economic progress, but do not use it to measure anything that has to do with welfare. Okay? And other guys in 1972, like Nordhaus and Tobin, said the same thing. It's about time we adjust it to capture social welfare issues. Okay? And speaking in the context of the global south, there are several other things that GDP does not capture. From the economic dimension, you're talking about poverty and inequality. Poverty and inequality in Africa, or the global south, for instance, takes a multi-dimensional flavor, right? It's not only income inequality. There are several: gender inequality, urban inequality, spatial inequalities, income inequality, all kinds of inequalities. When it comes to poverty as well, there's multi-dimensional poverty. It takes all kinds of different dimensions as well. And GDP, again, does not capture employment quality. In most countries, it doesn't capture the informal sector, doesn't capture vulnerable employment or underemployment for that matter. On the social front, there are issues like health and education variables, safety, law and order, well-being. Now, well-being is a problem area because you have both objective well-being and subjective well-being, all of which GDP does not capture. And then social inclusion is not also captured by GDP. The second part of the question is the wealth of nations, right? The wealth of nations is evolving. We started with the factors of production: land, labor, entrepreneurship, capital. Now there's innovation, there's digitalization, there's AI, there's technology is moving at a very fast pace. Even the capital itself, gross fiscal capital formation or fiscal capital, there's the hard infrastructure, there's the soft infrastructure, there's natural capital now that we are having to account for, the environment and the renewables. There's human capital dimension, health, education, on-the-job training. There's financial capital, and there's social capital. Some countries are very rich, but it's very violent, not safe. You cannot walk down the street. Such a nation cannot be said to be rich. Now, from that time to now, several attempts have been made to try to capture the other dimensions of social progress, economic progress, or the quality of life that GDP does not capture. Countries like New Zealand in 2019 came out with their new living standards framework and dashboard that looks at life expectancy, youth, not in employment and training, the Gini index, respect for the planet, greenhouse gas emissions. Canada came out with the quality of life framework, UK with the measures of national well-being framework, the gross national happiness by the Sultan of Brunei in 1974. Now, across all these different national attempts, you identify certain patterns. They all talk about life expectancy, they all talk about social dimensions, they all talk about health, they all talk about education, because the point is that a healthy, well-educated labor force is supposed to be a productive labor force. But today, mental health is a serious challenge globally. I had a very scary statistic that 1,500 men commit suicide every month or every, I hope it's not every day, that would be scary, but every month, something like that. So mental health is very important today. How do you capture that? Now, there are also global attempts that the United Nations Human Development Index, the HDI combines income, education, life expectancy to provide a more balanced picture. The OECD Better Life Index also talks about health, education, jobs, environment. The Genuine Progress Indicator also talks about the similar indicators. But underlying all these things is the challenge of measurement. Whatever, in my opinion, keep GDP as it is, let it do what it was designed to do, but how else can we capture what is remaining? Whatever we add to it, it has to be measurable, there has to be data to capture it, it has to be replicable statistically, it has to be possible for all the countries in the world to measure that. It's often said that what cannot be measured or what cannot be counted does not count, which is a very dangerous statement that I hear many times. I like to push back on that because there are some things that cannot be counted, but they're also very important. Like many gender equality variables cannot be counted today. There are not data to measure that, but they're extremely important. Like unpaid care work, how do you capture that? We are still working on data to capture that, but they're very important. So I would say that let's make sure we are able to count everything that matters. The things that matter that we cannot count, let's work towards counting them over time. But GDP should be left to measure what it measures, and let's capture what else is remaining to cover what is left. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sander Toldoy, Chief Economist from the Center for
Yes,
Europe.
thanks for inviting me. I also do not speak French very well, even though my economics has been described by some as rather French. So maybe my language needs to catch up with my content. I'm going to advance a slightly more bleak thesis on this question, even though I agree with Victor and Emmanuel that looking at broader indicators of well-being is super important. My bleaker thesis is that more and more countries around the world are measuring the wealth of nations in the form of power, including economic power, and that has profound implications. Let me give you 5 arguments. The old conception of the wealth of nations in globalization as it existed arguably until 2008 or maybe until 2020, as Victor was saying, when concerns about climate, COVID, China, and commercial supply chains really hit the fore. The old conception was that globalization would lead to more wealth, more people lifted out of poverty, interdependence, economic interdependence, ensuring a degree of peace. Few countries in the world believe more strongly in that than the Germans. They even have an expression for it, Wandel durch Handel. And in some ways it worked quite well. Particularly China developed very strongly, but not just China. And there were fault lines. There were tensions in the system. There were concerns about widespread tax evasion by multinationals. There were concerns about glowing concentrations of power and inequality. But I think in some ways that narrative has been, or that system is blown away by the 2 most important countries in the world, China and the US, foregoing that model in a much more fundamental way, because they care much more about power than they care about those outcomes. My second observation is that Europe is kind of an exemplary case of both your points. Europe still ranks in any top 20 list of well-being, life expectancy, happiness, educational outcomes, all the things that we all care about as human beings. And yet there is profound concern, exemplified in the Draghi report, that Europe's economic model is under threat, or if you speak to some American investors, they say doomed take whichever view you want. And I think there's some truth to that. I think there are two concerns. One is that Europe's growth and economic dynamism is declining. It's not in full-blown collapse, but it's declining versus others. And that makes it harder to sustain the kind of welfare systems, health systems, education systems that underpin those outcomes. That is the central Mario Draghi thesis, and I think he's right. And there's another concern that Europe is vulnerable to power coercion. The classic case being that the US cajoled the EU into a profoundly unbalanced trade deal signed in Turnberry, Scotland. Third observation. There are three concepts, I think, competing on the concept of economic power and sovereignty. There is the American concept, which is a form of predatory hegemony. The US will use power, including sanctions in the dollar system, including its power over defense in Japan or Europe, to coerce those countries into certain suboptimal economic outcomes. There is the autarkic version of China. China no longer really believes in interdependence. It's all exports, no imports. Its official economic paradigm now is called dual circulation, which means we want to produce all the goods that exist in the global economy, and services, by the way, at home, so that we're no longer coercible by anyone. And it has real implications. Chinese exports have grown by 40% over the last 5 years. Its imports have grown by 0. Take out semiconductors, its imports are down. So de facto, China is becoming less reliant on the world, and the rest of the world is becoming more reliant on China. The third model is what I would call networked sovereignty. It is the de facto model that the EU is pursuing with partners around the world, a system in which you remain open to each other, maybe less to China and the US, and share supply chains, share demand, do imports, exports, do investment. And the EU is doing this all over the place. New trade deals with India, with Mercosur. Some are controversial amongst French farmers, but the strategic message is Europe wants to work together with a group of, in Mark Carney's terms, middle powers. The EU has opened its defense procurement programs to Australia and Canada, not the US. And so there's lots of action happening under this bucket of network sovereignty. So you have kind of two poles. The one is onshore everything, do it all yourself, US, China. The other is collaboration with trusted partners, Europe. And the question is, which one will win the day? And that's my fourth argument. I don't think it's obvious that the Chinese and American models will dominate everything. They may. But we do live in an age of asymmetry. We've seen repeatedly that quite small countries, medium countries, can hold their own against bullying by the big guys. Iran held its own against the US. Whatever you think of it, that's factually true, by dominating the Strait of Hormuz. Taiwan lives on year after year because of its chokeholds that it holds in semiconductors. It's the only country capable of producing the best computer chips that go into this here, and so it's vital. Ukraine has held out against Russia in part because it's developed unique drone capabilities. And so my last argument, and fifth argument, is that there's a lesson here, I think, for middle powers, for Europe, for European partners, including Brazil and others, that you don't actually need to onshore everything. You just need to own specific asymmetric leverage, a certain layer in the energy supply chain, a certain layer in the semiconductor supply chain, a certain, let's say, layer in nuclear technology, which allows you to fight back when Beijing or Washington come knocking on your door. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our last intervention from Cyril Garcia, membre du comité exécutif de Capgemini, notre grand témoin pour ce.
Member of the executive board of Capgemini. We call him our big witness. I'm happy to be your witness and to listen to all the cicadas. There are three newcomers on this debate on indicators. Three new kids in town. That's the only English I will speak. Of course, there's the climate crisis and the economy of adaptation. I'll get back to that. There's the second kid is the impact of AI. And there's some sector dynamics that are generated by all that. On the climate crisis, we see it for many years, a few years now. The fundamentals of our economy, extract, produce, consume, are replaced by something else, which is more like recycling, innovating, investing, decarbonate, electrify. So all of that to say that we are entering an economy of adaptation and mitigation. And this economy is being created as we speak, and its pace of growth is going to be happening throughout all the various climate changes and disruptions, and the awareness that goes with it. Every year we measure with a center of company leaders the question of climate transition. What we're told at the beginning of 2026 is that 70% of them consider that the climate has a negative impact on their operations, whether we talk about supply chain, procurement of raw materials, water. 70% is no small number. And you all know that we have the first numbers on the impact on the EBITDA, profitability of companies, which you were mentioning when you talked about the European Research Center. It's between 15 and 20%. So this is a whole avenue of thinking about those wealth indicators that we need to tackle. The GDP, of course, but there are many of us who are starting to look at another indicator, which is a national product of circularity. Climate risk is very important. Something that I'd like to talk about as well later on is the cost of tokens and the token economy. And also, if you talk about inequalities, the level of inequalities in terms of climate and social inequalities. So the economy of adaptation, how do we follow it? How do we steer it? And how do we measure it? Then second new kid on the block is AI. I'm sure you're going to hear a lot about AI during those rencontres. For this innovation, you see the first numbers coming out on the value, the real value, tangible value of AI, 600 billion. That's the last number I read. And in this calculation, we put everything in, the creation, value creation, a reduction of costs. And there's a very concrete subject that I'd like to look at very closely, and I think next year we'll have more elements on this, is the real cost of tokens. A token is the emission right of the artificial intelligence. So we start having token budgets. I see Siemens, Orange in the room. So we don't know where we're going, but we all have started to use massively AI. Are we going to be paying social charges on this? Is a very French comment on tokens, but we won't be able to pay them in only one country. So this is going to be a fascinating subject for economists of regulation for the years to come. The third aspect is the sector dynamics that are generated by these first two points. If we look at insurance, as an insurer, we're going to go toward more and more regulation. The cost of resilience, we're going to have to declare our resilience. We're going to have to declare the fact that we did everything that we can. I'm talking about companies and private people to protect themselves from all those climate disasters. And the world of utilities. And it's not, we're not doing AI bashing here, but we know that 70% of the companies that we talk to consider or anticipate some loss of energy linked to the development of AI. If you look at the Bloomberg surveys, you see the impact of the cost of electricity, in the East Coast, the U.S. East Coast, linked to the use of data centers. So these are all fascinating conversations that we need to carry out. And when you were saying that we are the 4C, you were mentioning the 4C or the 5C, those are our new landmarks. We shouldn't say that we don't have any compass anymore, any landmarks anymore. We have to situate them with China and with AI. Thank you very much. Thank you. A few questions that are coming to mind, and hopefully we'll ask the room as well. I have a question for Sander Tordor, who was telling us about Europe, and Europe should wake up, and the Draghi report, etc. We should also think that we made progress on taking into account the indicators that are else other than the GDP per inhabitant, but we should not overlook it either, because didn't we take it a bit too far in taking into account all the aspects of the economy? And this is not why this, I mean, it still remains a very important point. My second question, maybe for all the speakers, you did talk about the fact that many countries have scattered initiatives to have wellness indicators. Mr. Cyril Garcia mentioned the necessity to take into account everything that is linked to AI. So we see that every time we need new indicators, and it's not very clear. And you also said that these new indicators are not necessarily going to be created by economists. So do we need, at the end of the day, a governance to agree together on what needs to be measured, and that all countries have to use the same indicators, or it's not necessary? It could be left up to each country to decide what they want to do. So these are my two first questions, maybe on the GDP by inhabitants. Sander Tordor.
Yeah, thanks for your question. It's a good question. In fact, one of the more interesting economics debates this year was what some of us are now calling the GDP PPP civil war amongst economists between the US and Europe, where Paul Krugman, the Nobel laureate, advanced a thesis that that Draghi is wrong and that Europe is actually not that far behind the US if you measure it in purchasing power terms. In other words, what you can buy with your money on a daily basis. And there were a bunch of rebuttals, including from my friend Luis Garicano, a former MEP, a Portuguese economist, and a Spanish economist, and a few others, who said, no, that's actually not entirely right. So it's a very live debate. My sense is that, in a way, both are correct. So if you measure in PPP terms today versus 10 years ago, the level between Europe and the US looks broadly similar. But it's very hard to measure across time how much you can really consume for your dollar or euro. And the better estimates that we have just of productivity and growth, you do see that Europe is falling a little bit behind the US. So insofar as those metrics correlate with human development outcomes, and quite frankly, the fiscal sustainability of our health systems and pension systems, I would tend to side a little bit with Lewis and a few others, saying there is a concern. It's not that Europe has to overhaul its entire economy, but you do want to have a little bit more dynamism. And then another second point I would make. So if you look at industrial policy around the world, there's an IMF report out today. The composition of industrial policy rationales has completely changed over the last 5 years. So in 2019, 30 to 40% of the measures was designed at raising prosperity, 30 to 40% was about climate, and then the rest was other topics. Now it's 80% geopolitics and supply chain security around the world. So just to give you a sense of my thesis, things have changed. The way in which you can marry some of the goals we all have here, which is better outcomes, still protecting the climate, I think is just thinking dual use. So Europe is going to spend hundreds of billions on defense. Let's try to use as much of that money as possible to build supply chains that are also helpful for the climate, like batteries or rare earths you need for defense kit, but you also need it for wind turbines. I think that's, it's a very pragmatic approach, but I do think there's some hope in that kind of dual-use thinking where you ride the geopolitical wave to still try to have better outcomes from a global public goods standpoint.
Thank you. So on my second question, maybe either you or both, how should we think about adapting when we need new indicators because some new things are happening, either complex supply chains, as you mentioned, or AI or other issues? Can we just go with national attempts and private attempts to measure these things, or is this very important to have coordinated effort on that front?
Okay, let me take a step back to from where he ended up. I think he described very well the external factors affecting how we grow, all right, or not able to grow. There's been a shift from a bipolar world to a multipolar world. There are several centers of power now, right? So you have the emergence of the middle powers as well, which is a good thing. If you ask me, it's a good thing. I mean, we've moved from East versus West to a multipolar world and several centers of power. That's a good thing. Now, what the side effect of that is that it has fragmented multilateralism. And unfortunately, with the power issue, bilateral relationships are now either transactional or exploitative. When a country says, you give me your critical minerals or I stop supporting your HIV program, then witch hunting steps in there, all right? And exploitation steps in there. Now, for us in the global south, we see an opportunity. And the opportunity is that we need to change how we grow, all right? We used to export our raw materials, no value addition and all that. All the critical minerals and the rare earth minerals the world needs to achieve the net zero transition or the green industrialization can be found on the African continent. The question is, do we make the same mistakes that we made with oil and gas or not? We need to think differently. We need to grow differently. And the difficulty is that we are the youngest continent with a very high population of youth. The median age is 19 years. And the global the youth dividend cannot be realized if there are no jobs. The question is, how do we transform our economies in a way that grows jobs or creates jobs for our body unit population? Now, coming to the measurement of the GDP or what should be done, 3 key things come to mind. First of all, how inclusive is the generation of the growth? And then how equitable, the second thing, the distribution of the gains from the growth. And the two together, to what extent does it improve the welfare of people, both objective and subjective, the welfare of the planet in terms of the environmental footprint of our growth and transformation, and the welfare of the future in terms of the sustainability dimension? Are we growing at the expense of future generations to grow or not? Now, all these factions and sub-dimensions that I've mentioned have indicators that measure them. The secondary data already captured by almost all the countries in the world to measure any variables of inclusion or most variables of inclusion, most variables of equity, if you want to address the multi-dimensional inequalities that we have, whether it's income or gender or spatial or whatever dimension you have, or the multi-dimensional types of poverty we have, there are variables and data to measure that. And when it comes to well-being of people, the challenge is subjective well-being. That's where the challenge is. And that's where many countries still have to work harder, because what makes him happy is not what makes me happy. What makes him sad is not what makes me sad. So how do you determine the criteria for what should make somebody sad or happy? Now, or satisfied with life, or fulfilled with life, or feel trusted or respected in society. Certain subtle, subjective well-being challenges come in that are very difficult to measure, and more work is needed to do on that. But there's a clear, from GDP to additional variables, there has to be some channels and causal pathways from which we can build from GDP, link the social dimensions, the environmental dimensions, to make sure that we capture all the necessary variables that are also needed to capture living standards, quality of life, economic progress, and human well-being. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Donc on va ouvrir la...
Now we're going to listen to you. We'll take questions from the floor, but a very final question to you, Cyril Garcia. When we discussed before this panel discussion, you insisted on the importance of the content of jobs and the transformation of employment. Well, back to basics. And to continue on climate, today we know how to measure the content in terms of employment of the energy transition. Some countries are doing the maths, and I see that the economists in the UK know the numbers. They know what for the UK represents the development of renewable energies in terms of employment. They've counted, that's 1 million jobs in 5 years. It's an annual growth of 10% that we're looking at, and the impact can be measured. In the gross national product, that's 100 billion sterling pounds. Now, what I meant is that the economists nowadays should look into these topics. Otherwise, it's the Wild West, the wild world. We need a group of economists and intellectuals and academics who think and work on that. Apart from the other conversation, which is growth versus degrowth, which could be nice for the elections in France, but not good enough for the global conversation. Because otherwise, the risk, if we come back to AI again, the risk is that the world will be the world of open AI, and the other world, which will be the Claude world, and perhaps another underworld that will be called Mistral. That's what's lurking in the dark. That's what might happen if, at global level, we can't think alike, if we can't perhaps work with the lawmakers, the regulators. But jobs is a very important question. And it's curious to see that in some countries like France, we're too shy. It seems that we don't want to measure all of this objectively. Thank you very much. Would you like to react to this? Yes, please, Victor.
To react, but Cyril just provoked me a bit. There's one indicator that is not for economists to define, but rather for scientists, which is carbon footprint. And this is a very important indicator for a country like mine. And we do not have a consensus on measuring carbon footprint according to the country. And I cannot contain myself. I'm trying. But when I hear economics of adaptation, and this is not going to be very sympathetic to the French, what I hear is protectionism. I hear protectionism in terms of, deforestation measures. I hear protectionism in terms of CBAM, for those of you who don't know what it is. Measures at the border that basically restrict the importation of goods from developing countries. So it's basically outright protectionism against developing countries. Yes, there's a lot to be done by all of us in terms of internationalizing the way we view the environment. But let's think about the other consequences of the environment as well. I'm sure Cyril will react to this. So important indicators, and to reply to your question, Alexandra, it would be great if we can compare things that are comparable in different countries. I mean, what is the value of having a little indicator in my own country if the other country has a different indicator and there's no sort of software that dialogues with one another. So it's very important that we have the same basis so that we compare things that are comparable. After all, the real indicator is who's going to win the World Cup, right?
Thank you, Victor.
It's a double provocation. Donc, évidemment, on a...
Well, this is good. This is a debate. This is a debate. You have given us 5 minutes. Right. Now, for those who are not familiar with that, the adaptation topic is very much loaded. Now, what I can tell you is that this also includes mitigation measures. So, well, we're talking about what the states are doing, but what we're seeing on a global scale is that even though the Trump administration has changed in the past months, we've seen that the large industrialists are still bickering about reducing, or fighting rather, to reduce emissions. And they have plans, they're rolling out the plans. We can say, okay, there's money at stake. Sometimes they don't want to mention the capital expenditure that they spend, but it's a cultural battle that is won. Now, what matters is how quickly we can execute. And the underlying challenge is that the academics have to work on this, is that if AI has a value, AI has to serve this purpose. That is, thanks to AI, we have to improve the performance of the maintenance of dams in Brazil, or better maintenance in French nuclear power plants, for instance. So this is what we have to think about. We have a group of thinkers, and that's my message to you, dear friends. Don't give up. Don't give up. Please continue and impose this conversation, this indicator conversation. But everybody has to understand what you're talking about, including corporates. Okay, now the time has come to listen to you. Now we have a roving mic that we're going to give you in the room if you have any questions to ask to any of the panelists. Don't be shy. Who's going to start? Would you like to talk about adaptation or perhaps measuring social or environmental progress? Hello, I'm Sylvain Brich. I'm Deputy CEO of this Human Rights Watch, an NGO defending human rights. And I have a question to ask. Oh, well, you know, this conversation didn't really focus on standard setting, as if we were just talking about what should we measure. I don't really agree. It's not empirical. It's not the question just for the economists. What we want to measure is what we want to do. In the past, we measured GDP because we needed to have more resources available. Now the question at hand is that we need new indicators. For instance, if we increase the number of resources, is this our objective? Do we have enough resources to live well? If we live well, how can we distribute this wealth? Or do we need to create more resources? Perhaps at the expense of the planet. If this is the case, we'll no longer be able to live on the planet. That's the question. It's not an economic question, it's political, it has to do with sociology and politics. Do we have enough resources? If we have enough resources, shall we share them? And there's something else we didn't mention. There's a United Nations report that was out 3 or 4 weeks ago on the new indicators. They've come up with new indicators, some new indicators. These are proposals, by the way, statistical measures and proposals. Nobody's talked about this UN reports. There are tangible initiatives that have been taken. Now, what we're missing is not economic grey matter, but it's the political choices. Do we want to create more resources? Is this the objective? Or do we want people to live better, to be better off? Thank you for asking. I'll start, if you don't mind. Now, Sylvain, you didn't listen carefully when I started saying something. I said, the whole point is not to think just in terms of extraction, consumption and use. Of course, we have limited resources, you're right. My point is not to say the main topic is sharing. It's the role of groups of academics and intellectuals and economists. The question is to share resources, the resources that we still have, and this sharing should be a fair sharing of resources. My point, what we're saying is that we have the technology today, the world has the technology, so we can roll out these policies. It's a pity that it takes so much time to phase them in. And today we have all the knowledge we need to have. We've analyzed the underground, we know where water is, we know how to perhaps make forecasts on climate changes. So what is key is sharing, you're right. But I think we talked about this. Anybody else who'd like to talk about this or react to the question that was asked?
Maybe just to take your question together with your criticism of CBAM. I understand that there is frictions on CBAM. Again, that's the external carbon tax on Europe's border with developing countries whose firms struggle to pay that tax. And frankly, there's measurement issues too, because it's very hard to know the precise carbon intensity of any given, let's say, steel plant anywhere around the world. But to the question from the audience, it is an attempt by Europe to essentially export carbon pricing, trying to price the environmental damage from CO2 emissions, and to try to push other countries to join the effort. So it is, in a way, a standard-setting mechanism. You could disagree, you could say it's too much, it's too unfair, too ambitious, but I think in its fundamental design, where you have a domestic carbon tax and an external one, it is not a bad policy design. And so I do think it's worth thinking about. And in fact, some countries, especially in Europe's neighborhood, have adopted similar policies. And in the discussions between India and the EU, who just signed what Commission President von der Leyen calls the mother of all trade deals, this is also a source of discussion. And India seems to be wanting to kind of maybe get exemptions on the CBAM or finding a deal where they do more ambitious climate policy in India. So I don't think it's as bleak as you said. I think there's some value in that kind of policy.
Yeah, Alexandra, I'll have to reply. Yes, the design is good. It's the way you implement that is not so good, because there's also all types of exemptions that the Europeans have put in it to their sectors of their interest. So if you're going to put a measure in place, go all the way. Don't exempt some of your own producers that prejudice the others. You know that. We have, I mean, I'm sure you do. So, again, we're talking about indicators. How are they useful to promote cooperation in the world in terms of trade, in terms of understanding what is the environmental impact, so forth and so on. I have to say something that, again, sort of hurts me, but these types of measures, based on sort of indicators that are not so certain, does one thing. It pushes countries like Brazil to sell everything to China and to become very friendly with China. So in a way, Europe, the US, they're pushing Brazil and others to be very friendly with China. China provides investment. China buys minerals. Yeah, it is a type of colonial relationship because they're buying commodities. What the heck? This is what we can sell at this moment. If we're not selling to the EU, if we're not selling to the US, there's a big market in China for agricultural products and for minerals.
Merci beaucoup. Il nous reste le temps peut-être pour...
Thank you very much. We'll take a very final question. Anybody with a question? Yes, please. Well, 2 questions. We'll take them both. Yes, sir, and then madam. Hello, thank you very much. Yanis Triki. I work at the OECD on the industrial policy and subsidies and grants. Thank you very much for this conversation. That's very interesting. Now, can we talk about 2 other topics? I'd like to get your views on that, given your positions. First, the question of employment in different industries. In Europe, we're talking about the China shock and the destruction of employment in the car making industry. And we're talking about the Chinese investments made abroad in all the OECD and non-OECD countries. In Brazil, for instance, the car making industry, there's BYD. But does that mean creating jobs, creating value that's interesting for these countries? Big question mark. Many doubt about this. Many say it's good, but I think that in Brazil, we have some that are saying that this is window dressing. And the other question is that of the debt. How do we measure debt levels today? What would you say about the debt of OECD countries in Europe and also the non-OECD countries? Because they probably have their own views on the debt. Okay, we'll take a second question. A final question over there, please. And then we'll answer. And we'll try and wrap up. Thank you, Camille Morfaz. I'm advisor to the president. I'm in charge of what we call global affairs. I have a question that I think you talked about quickly. Africa is the youngest continent, as you said. Now, if we look at the nation's wealth indicators, I mean, what about population growth? Is this an indicator? How do you factor this in when you think about this in general in your specific fields? The first question on Africa, perhaps, and demographics? Well, not just about Africa, we're saying.
It's much higher than, our population growth is higher than our GDP growth, if I can say it that way. So we are growing more in human beings more than we're growing the economy. And that's where the challenge is. The second thing is how we grow. We grow at the back of primary commodity exports. And so when prices and global demand do well, we grow. When prices and global demand doesn't do well, the economies contract. So the growth is not driven by structural fundamentals of the economy. It's driven by external factors. Now, that kind of growth does not create enough decent jobs, all right? So the pass-on effect to household disposable income, to human well-being, to productivity, to technological upgrading and all that doesn't happen. So we are stuck in this raw material export box. Now, we've been trying to industrialize, move out of that box, to move up the value chain, to add value to our raw materials, through agro-processing, light manufacturing, to supported by sophisticated services. And that hasn't happened over half a century now. But as we are waiting to achieve that, more babies are born every day, and then people growing the population faster than the economy is growing. That's where our challenge is. So once we can change how we grow, in asset we say that it is not enough to grow. You need to transform. And we define transformation as growing with DEPTH. Now, DEPTH is an acronym for diversified production and exports, export competitiveness, productivity of labor, technological advancements, and human well-being. We researched into early transformers in East Asia, Latin America, and we identified these 5 key interventions that they did, and that's how they were able to move from where we used to be half a century ago. Countries like Korea, Japan, Malaysia, Indonesia, we were at the same socioeconomic level. The landscape was the same with African countries. Half a century later, There are middle-income countries, higher middle-income countries. African countries are still poor. These are the 5 things they did that we have refused to do or been unable to do over the past half-century. Diversifying production and export, improving competitiveness, export competitiveness, improving productivity of labor by building the right skill sets that meets the needs, the skills needs of our economic growth strategies and our trade strategies, advancing technology, and improving human well-being.
Merci beaucoup. Victor sur le Brésil et je vais conclure d'un mot.
Thank you, Victor, on Brazil, and then I'll conclude.
Work at the OECD measuring subsidies. Your recent report is just amazing, including subsidies from China, right? Which have this potential of basically wiping out the industry in several countries. It already happened with solar panels. Danger is that it happens with EVs. We know the state of the auto industry in Europe, especially in electric vehicles. China, of course, already dominates completely the ion lithium batteries by 80–90%. So a big problem, right? And it's important that we have these data very clear in front of us so that decision makers can take those decisions. And organizations such as the OECD really help in us understanding that. In terms of Brazil, yeah, many doubts, question marks about BYD investment in Brazil. Is that going to bring jobs? Is that going to bring the ecosystem of the auto industry? Are the spare parts going to be built in around the assembly line, or are they bringing CKDs from China and just, putting them together? It's the same problem in Hungary, by the way. Exactly the same problem. You know it well. So yeah, lots of question marks in there. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Juste en réponse.
Thank you very much. To answer the question about population growth, what's difficult with demographic indicators? We don't really know how to monitor them. And as far as population is concerned and the number of children who are born, it's difficult to do anything with these variables. But of course we have to factor them in. They're very important in all that we do. Okay, we've talked about many things. I think what's important is that we shouldn't forget about GDP per capita. This is something essential. But also, I think we need to do more. There's awareness of what's at stake, and we've improved on front of measurement. But what really matters is cooperation between the different countries, the different initiatives, so that we agree on the objectives, so that we're all aligned, and so that we exactly know where we want to go. Thank you very much, and well, thank you.
it's not me willing to insist, but I think...
Is it something I said?
I have nothing to say.
You've got the short straw, you have to sit next to me. So I think our first album cover is this, with us all holding the microphone.
Mesdames, Messieurs,
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome.
global security architecture, a light topic for this very warm afternoon, I guess. My name is Romain Lequignou. I'm the managing director of Eurocreative, which is the first French think tank focusing specifically on Central Eastern Europe. And I'm very proud to be here because, first of all, thanks a lot for the organizers to put this session, because I think it's a very interesting session. But also on personal level, I'm very happy to be here because I used to be a student in this beautiful city of Aix-en-Provence. So that's a great thing to be here again and to talk about security, because this is the topic that we are all talking about days and days and days. This is very important. Of course, we know, nothing to remind you, this is about Ukraine since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, but this is also about the Middle East and the tensions that we have today, also in the Gulf countries. We will come back to this, and also tensions in Asia, and, well, frankly speaking, a bit of everywhere in the world at the moment. But security is not just hard security and military stuff. This is also about soft security, and here we can talk about democratic security, we can talk about the governance of digital, of AI, we can talk about climate, of course, and we can talk about economic security. This is about how we will find a way to be resilient as societies, as countries, as states, as European Union. But also how we will build together global governance for those topics, because, as you know, multilateralism is a bit in crisis. And so those are the topics that we will deal today. We will first answer a very easy question, which is, what is going on? How is the security architecture, the global security architecture these days? And second question, which is a bit more prospective, what can we do about this? So easy questions, just 55 minutes I've heard, but I will be helped by our wonderful guest today. I have the pleasure to introduce you to Omar Ashour. You are professor from Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Welcome. We have also on my left Rob De Week. You are founder of the Hague Center for Strategic Studies from the Netherlands. We have also Céline Kaufmann, who is program director of the Institut du Développement Durable et des Relations Internationales, l'IDRI. And last but not least, we have Simon Radford. You are director of Milken Institute from the UK. So welcome you all. And as a welcome gift, I would like to ask you the same question, a very short question. So please be focused, try to answer in 1 minute, because what I want to ask you is basically, what is your diagnosis of the current global security architecture? Do you see it mostly as something, you know, which is a process of adaptation, or this is mostly about a continuous fragmentation, or are we experiencing a genuine rupture? And I would like to ask you first, Rob, to start.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also, thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. This is a permanent rupture. The things are changing completely. And I think that should be acknowledged. Politicians should be aware of this. It all started not with Trump. That is what quite a few people think. It started, let's say, 25 years ago, when China became a member of the World Trade Organization. Then we saw gradually changing the rules-based order in the advantage of, for example, countries like China. So there is really something going on, and that means that the traditional world order, as we know it today, or until recently, is dying. We live in an interregnum. So the old world order has died, but the new doesn't still exist. That is bad news for us, because that means that the world will move from crisis to crisis, and that is something that probably will stay still with us for maybe 10, 20 years, something like that, because that is normally what will happen if you have a rupture like this. And then the whole world will settle down with a new hegemon. And then you will have normal relations again. But the world will change completely. The world will change into a more transactional world. That means that zero-sum games are really on the agenda. This is power struggle, and we Europeans, and that's my final word, have to learn how to deal with a new situation, because this is completely opposite to what we've experienced over the last many decades, maybe even centuries. And we have to adapt to this new world where the power shifts from the US to China, if we want it or not.
Yes, Omar, do you think also that the old world is dead or dying?
So it's not dead, but it is very sick, I would say. It's not a total rupture, but it's a partial rupture. And why do I think that? So the world where the United States provided security provisions, the world when one state, a larger state like Saddam's Iraq, invades a smaller state like Kuwait, and the United States mobilizes 900,000 soldiers from all over the world, from Asia, from Africa, from the Middle East, Europe, and liberates the country after 100 hours ground fighting and 37 days air operation. That world is over, okay? Why? Because if you fast forwarded, and I agree totally, it did not start with Trump. It's actually, the highlight was during the Obama years. In 2014, and by the way, Kuwait did not have a security agreement with the United States. Kuwait was not part of NATO. It did not sign any defense agreement with the United States. The United States did this as an initiative without a binding document. Fast forward to 2014, and you'll find the Russian invasion, first invasion of Ukraine, annexing Crimea and invading parts of the Donbass. And the United States, and also another country, the United Kingdom, had a document that is called the Security Assurances for Ukraine, Budapest Memorandum for Security Assurances. They were supposed to security assure Ukraine, and instead, rather than mobilizing 900,000 soldiers and a global coalition to stop the invasion of Crimea or to liberate Crimea afterwards, they asked the Ukrainian armed forces not to fight. This is under the Obama administration, it's documented now, and under also the German chancellorship under Merkel. So that's the contrast, if you wish it, and it highlights how ruptured is that. But why am I saying it's not over yet? Because actually sometimes in 2017, Qatar almost got invaded. So a small country almost got invaded. And basically under the Trump administration, mainly because of the Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, the invasion was stopped because of US pressures. So it's not totally over. And NATO still works, and this is the good news, because there's a reason Ukraine was invaded, but not Estonia. Ukraine in 2022, in January 2022, Ukraine had 21 maneuver brigades, okay, larger than any conventional force in Europe. It was the largest ground-based air defense park in the entire continent. Okay, it still got invaded. Estonia was not invaded, which is a much smaller country, much smaller force, much vulnerable, but it was part of NATO. So in that sense, elements of that old structure, old system is still working. It's still deterring. It may deteriorate even further, but it's still there. We better keep it. But also we have very new dynamics. And one final dynamic of it is now very difficult because of the technology, because of the democratization of forces, if you wish, in one way. It is very difficult for a large state, including the United States or the Russian Federation, to defeat a smaller state. And we see this very clearly in Ukraine, we can elaborate on that, but also we see it very clearly in Iran, with 21,000 strikes, decapitation of the entire political and the military leadership at one point, and 40 days later, Iran is standing on both feet and punching with both hands, ending with 100 waves on Israel and 100 strikes on the Gulf in the 40th day.
Yes.
So
we will continue on this. Céline, we heard about full rupture, we heard about partial rupture. Where do you stand there?
I'm not going to answer your question, but
Perfect.
I'm going to give you 3 points.
Perfect.
Maybe to come back to what you were saying earlier, Romain. First, that we have to understand security in a broad sense, going beyond peacekeeping and defense, because this is the way individuals and countries alike understand their security. They don't limit it to military security. And the pandemics, the natural disasters, the extreme weather events, the macroeconomic imbalances are all creating frictions and affecting that security. That's why, if you follow a bit the political discussions of this year, we've heard a lot about energy security, we've heard a lot about food security, we've heard a lot about economic security. The second message is, and it's really about analyzing, the diagnostic that you were mentioning. There is an illusion and a tendency towards autarky, doing it, in small groups or doing it by one country alone. But what the experience tells us is that no country on earth, even the biggest, can actually do it by itself, because all countries are interdependent. They, depend on supply chains, they depend on pollution coming from other countries, they depend on policies adopted in other countries. And so international cooperation, obviously, is the word. And the last message is, there is an international cooperation infrastructure. It comes with the UN, the Bretton Woods institutions, a myriad of intergovernmental organizations and initiatives that have developed over the 20th century mostly. But of course, today, those institutions are a bit outdated and they create frustration. They are outdated when you look at the fact that this year, 7 out of 9 planetary boundaries have been crossed. So they don't deliver on that. They're outdated also because you can see the frustration of a number of countries, including the developing economies, in terms of the development dividends that they've provided. It doesn't mean we need to throw those institutions, out with the water, the baby, and so on, but it means that there's something to fix in those institutions for tomorrow.
Yep. Simon, what's to fix?
What's to fix, what's not to fix might be a quicker answer. First of all, thank you for having me here, and it's an honor to share this panel with such other wonderful guests. Your first question was about the security architecture. Ordinarily, the actual security architecture that we know of and think of tends to only really change after very large wars, maybe even world wars. So we still have NATO. The question is, how useful is it? We still have the UN General Assembly. The question is, how useful is it? We don't really have a new architecture. What I guess is interesting maybe is the new interior decoration within the house that we're building, rather than the architecture of the house, and maybe who's in what room and what's happening outside of the house. So in terms of sort of the nature of security, I think fundamentally we've been slow to catch up on this, that what we mean by security and how we measure it has changed. So if you go back to the last Cold War, if I can provocatively call it that, George Kennan basically had a theory of containment that said there were 4 or 5 or 6 industrial heartlands in the world, and that if the West, which was a kind of construction of the time, could make sure the Soviet Union didn't dominate a majority of them, then it could outproduce enough steel, iron, tanks, whatever, to win any war. And then internal contradictions would take care of itself in terms of the Soviet Union, and so it transpired. Today, warfare doesn't look like who can produce the most tanks. It is much more about not necessarily material, it's about the immaterial. It's not just about production, it's about IP plus production. But importantly, it's not about how much stuff can we churn out, which look exactly the same from a factory. It's about how quickly can we change the factory? How quickly can we change the IP? How quickly can we change the design? We live in a world of rapid adaptation and rapid development and rapid capabilities. And that's very different. And weirdly, you could look at Russia before, and you could, IISS does a wonderful thing every year where it lists everyone's military capabilities. And you could say, ooh, I think I could beat that country in a war. It has 10 tanks and I have 15. It doesn't work like that anymore. Intentions are harder to understand. Capabilities are harder to understand. How rapidly you can change and update your capabilities are even more hard to understand. So the architecture that we have, and I'll leave you with this thought, the technologies that are going to define the next security paradigm is AI, quantum, and all the rest of it too. There have been attempts to build some architecture around it in terms of AI safety and other things, but it's very clear there's no interest, really, in building multilateral security architecture around those things. People think of it as a global race, and that's the analogy that's used. And so the question is, will that race throw up a more uncertain world with more miscalculations and war, or is it something that we can bring some transparency, clarity, and stability to?
Very well. Rob, I would like to come back to you and especially jump on this uncertainty and talk about NATO. We already talked quite a lot about NATO, and I'm very happy because in France it has been for many years, you know, a topic that was controversial sometimes, politically speaking, I would say. Since 2022, I would say that, you know, political military elites here have been talking greatly about NATO, as never before, I would say. Why? Because NATO became, or it was clear to everyone that NATO is indeed the key pillar of the security of Europe. At the same time, there is a lot of uncertainty because of the Trump administration, not only, but because also of the erratic behavior of the administration, we could say, but also because, you know, we've never been that uncertain about Article 5, which is the basis of NATO. So how do you see it? How do we balance this, you know, this need of keeping NATO and at the same time building European security, maybe without our biggest ally?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that is also the key question. I remember that your president Macron once said that NATO is brain dead, and I believe that this is still the case. We talk very favorably about NATO, but it all comes down about the Article 5 guarantee. Now, if this is not credible, including the extended deterrence obligation of the US, that is about nuclear weapons, then we really have a problem. And we are not certain about this. And I travel around Europe all the time, and also in the Baltic states, and I've never spoken to someone who is really very optimistic about this. So this is really a problem. I remember very well, I think it was 2018, when I attended the NATO summit in Brussels. That was really a historical summit because NATO almost died. That was the first summit attended by Trump. And I remember shaking and trembling. Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, came in. He was sitting almost next to me. And he said, well, I think NATO has died. And he told the story also in his memoirs. But it was exactly the reason why I came to the conclusion when Trump was re-elected that probably NATO would not survive. Now, this is really a big problem. And if you look what Trump is doing, he has disregard for the international rule of law. You can say about Maduro, the president of Venezuela, whatever you want, because I really don't like him. But what the Americans did was simply not according to the international law. The same holds true for the bombardments of ships with probably illegal drug transports. You can say on Iran whatever you want about the regime, but what happened there was sheer stupidity. There is an US before and after the Iran war. And I think that is what people don't understand. Because what happened, for example, when Trump, after postponing his first visit to China, if you then have a discussion with President Xi, then you lost already. So what happened there is the keys to the world and to world order were handed over during this last visit from Trump to Xi. And that is really quite dramatic for world order. So what should we do in Europe? Should we come up with something completely different, abandon NATO and build another security organization? Well, my advice is don't do this in times of crisis, because we now need the organization. It's not only about Article 5, but it's also about a host of other regulations and functions of NATO. But we can have a further discussion on that. But keep it and develop not a European pillar within NATO, but try to develop a NATO that can function without the US. And we can have a further discussion on that, but it is absolutely doable. And what we see in Europe is the emergence of ad hoc groupings that drive the whole thing forward. For example, we had the so-called Weimar Triangle not that long ago, right after the inauguration of Trump. And this was France, Poland and Germany who tried to take the initiative. Then the UK came in. And we need something like that. We need a security council in Europe, for example. And so what will happen is that we will have a small group of countries driving the whole process forward. That is more or less happening, but it doesn't go fast enough. And there are too many national priorities and preoccupations that really slow down the whole process. And we simply do not have the time for that anymore.
Absolutely. Speaking of not having the time, I guess that in Qatar you had also this kind of impression a few months ago when, you know, a country that is seen as very rich, very stable, then suddenly you had some drones flying over, I mean, in Qatar and in different countries in the region and attacking directly critical infrastructures. That doesn't say that you are at war today, fully war, right? It's not a full-scale war, but still, this is something that has to be fixed. And this is my question for you as well. How do you see this transformation of war? How do you see also the transformation of alliance? Because we talk a lot about the US in Europe, but in your region, you talk a lot about the US as well, because part of the bilateral agreements in the region, the stability of the region, to some extent relied also on a strong partnership with the US. So how do you see it, and how do you see the evolution of the global security architecture considering the new tendencies, hybrid warfare and the stuff?
So there are a lot of similarities between the Gulf security framework and Europe. I think it was one of the famous Belgian statesmen that said that there are two types of states in Europe: small states and states who do not recognize that they are small. So in the Gulf, it's actually like that. That's including the largest one.
We might disagree on this.
Yeah. And with Europe, there's still the French two-dyad nuclear capabilities, which the Gulf lack. And then with the UK, which is not a very dependent and one-leg nuclear deterrence capability, but it's still there. So there's more security, I would say, on the Gulf side, much more experience in terms of combined arms, multi-domain operations, and so on. But just one point on NATO, and I'll return quickly to the Gulf. NATO was enlarged post the 90s with about 15 members, okay? So that's on paper. In reality, it's 65% less soldiers, 55% less tanks, and 35% less artillery tubes. So the actual hardware, the actual power has been decreased, plus the unconventional dimension as well. So that by itself is a signal to the whatever adversary is that we're not as strong as before. So that's one, despite being richer than before. Back to the Gulf. All states in the Gulf are not born equal. So the strategies were different. The Qatari strategy specifically was in a way vindicated, mainly because they approached more of a hedging policy and more of a peace diplomacy dimension. So they were hit less. If you looked at the actual figures, the drones that targeted Doha were about 112. The drones that targeted the United Kingdom were north of 2,200. The ballistic missiles were doubled, so Qatar was hit with about 250 ballistics. The UAE was north of 5,500. So overall, it was the country that embarked on a confrontational policy. It was hit the hardest. The country that was, embarking on mediation and attempting peace diplomacy was still hit, still destroyed some of its very useful facilities. But was hit less, and I was among the scholars who were saying, the battlefield is supreme, and the ultimate word is for the battlefield. Now I'm giving some credit for diplomacy because it made the job of air defense crews much easier in that sense. But is it a new security architecture in the region? Definitely it is. You have now a country that, which is Iran, that did not collapse. after significant, so I mentioned 21,000 airstrikes plus the new ones. The regime seems to be still intact, seems to very cleverly weaponize geography in a way that is very, had some technological dimension, but also very, very raw. So you have the mines that we had in the tanker war in 1980s. You had the fast attack craft boat, also 1980s technology, nothing new there. Coastal missiles, we had it as well, but they did not have. It was not that sophisticated in the 80s, and they were less numerous. And then the new technology, which is the strike architecture. So the mixture of attacking your adversaries with ballistic, cruise, loitering munitions, and drones, all four. So you send the package, and therefore you confuse and make the air defenses, which Ukraine is suffering from, on a daily basis. Most recently, actually this morning. But with the Gulf, it was the same, but lesser in terms of numbers and lesser in terms of the intensity compared to what was going on in Ukraine. But they're also very small countries. So one last bit: the challenge is endemic in the Gulf. Why? All of the targets are immobile. So you cannot move the gas facility. You cannot move the airport. You cannot move the desalination facility. Their location is known on Google Maps. You can find it. If you pre-program Shahed 136s, which is a type of loitering munitions that the Iranians used, you pre-program it before and send 50, 100. If the air defense catches 95, still 5 will do the damage, enough damage. Because the target, you cannot move it, it won't go anywhere, and it's big, and it's vulnerable, and it's expensive, then you are vulnerable for a very long time. And that's the real challenge in the Gulf. And I think Europe is suffering from similar challenges right now. Better air defense, better capabilities, larger countries, but similar challenges.
It's about numbers and capabilities, right? We will talk about this a bit later, but I think that we will just go back also to a larger definition of security and not just military and hard security, even if I really like it. But how basically do you see it, Céline? Because, if I may formulate it like this, one of the victims of, this ongoing militarization of our global scene, basically, is climate change. From time to time we talk about climate change, especially when it's 42 degrees in Paris, but we don't talk about this too much in the end, much less than a few years before. So how do you see the possibility to keep the topics such as climate change into our vision of security of the global architecture, and what is the link basically? Because we talk a lot about resilience. Is resilience the link between soft and hard security?
Yeah, thank you very much. And you're completely right. Everybody can see the backlash on the environment, on climate, on sustainable development as well. And when you look at what has happened in the last few years, the extreme example is obviously the US, which is actually banning this wording in a lot of international organizations, negotiations, discussion, but they're not the only ones. So what happened is, like in 2024, you may have noticed that half the planet went to the polls. They went to vote. It was a year where there was a lot of change in leaderships, and the leaderships that came in power, most of them were less, sensitive to sustainable development, to the environment issues. So we can date that back to 2024. And of course, it was a reflection of the aspiration of the population that has changed, that we're concerned about economic issues, about, jobs, very concretely on the ground. So we could see that, in the European Parliament as well, and we have a big backlash against what we call the Green Deal, which is the framework that providing the long-term direction for sustainable development in Europe. But to answer your question, I would say reality is sticky. And it's not because you can't say the words climate, sustainable development, and so on, that sustainable development does not invite itself to the table. And I think the latest G7 and to some extent the previous G20 are a perfect illustration of that, because during the last G7 what we had was the Iran war. And the Iran war, in many ways, is a reminder of the vulnerabilities that we suffer from being too dependent on fossil fuels. And after the war break and the Hormuz Strait was closed, there was a lot of discussion on how do we transition away, how do we diversify our sources of energy. That's one example. The second one is referred to your mention of resilience. What we see happening is a growing number of natural disasters related to climate, of extreme weather events like the heat waves that we had in Europe last week and is coming back. And the consequence of that is that in the G7, in the G20, the ministers of finance are discussing the economic impact and instability related to those extreme weather events impacts and natural disaster impacts. And they're also discussing some of the financial and fiscal consequences, because what we see in the face of that is that the insurance coverage, even in rich countries, is going down. And so there is an issue for the public budget on how, which is the insurer in the last resort, on how they're going to continue, paying for the increasing impact and cost of these natural disasters and extreme weather events. We've seen as well, the issue of critical raw materials being at the center of the G7 discussion this year. And this is as much about defense as it is about digital transition, as it is about green transition. So even without saying the word, in any case, you're talking about, pieces of the puzzle to move the climate agenda ahead. But, of course, there is, a number of international conventions. There is a number of international instruments that were developed. Especially back in 2015, that was the year of the Paris Agreement on climate. It was the year of the Sustainable Development Goals, an amazing year when you think where we are 10 years after, where countries came together and said we have to cooperate on sustainable development on the Paris Agreement. And those, in a way, frameworks, what they did at the time was to give a long-term direction for countries, right? Because the Paris Agreement was more or less, providing targets on carbon neutrality by 2050, 2060 for countries. The SDGs were giving intermediary targets by 2030. So what they had to do was to anchor directions and expectations for countries. So what's happening today is that we are in the midst of implementing these agreements. And implementation is hard. So at the international level, we had a series of rules that were established, countries agreed on, and is great. But now what we have to push for is the implementation of these agreements. And this is where we're getting at the granular level into the sectoral issues. We're getting at the granular level into some of the lobbies that are actually fighting off because their business model is no longer sustainable. And this is where the international system, going back to what the topic of the discussion, is not completely fit for purpose, because the international framework is good for developing laws, legal frameworks, is not super good at helping with implementation. And this is the major change that we need to see, that the UNFCCC, the Convention on Climate Change, that the other instances where this is discussed turns towards helping countries implement those agreements rather than developing new legal instruments.
Absolutely. We will try, Simon, to continue on this linkage between soft security, hard security, and I think that one of the good linkage that we didn't talk too much about is money, and we have a big money problem. We're not that rich anymore. We are not that rich simply, right? And so that's a big problem because, if we talk about climate change, we need to adapt our infrastructures. It costs a lot of money. It's a lot of research and development also. We need to be faster with new technologies to adapt our societies, to adapt our infrastructures, etc., etc. When we talk about drones, massification, not rocket science to build drones, to be honest. It's a bit of AI and like some plastic. It's not very difficult, but you need to restart industries, you need to employ people, so you need money to start the process and to be sure that people, are basically devoted to it in the long term. So my question is basically, if we are talking about rebuilding or reinforcing, strengthening our global security architecture, how do we talk about the financing architecture? And there is one question here, which is related when one big topic we have, which is competitiveness. How can we finally, in Europe, make sure that we ally the private budgets with the private money with the public budgets, and how we make sure to invest smartly, because we will not have the money we want. That's a certitude.
Great question. I think we've talked about the architecture, we talked about the interior decoration, and now you're asking me about the plumbing. So we'll do the whole house. It's great. The answer is, I mean, I talked a bit about how it's about rapid adaptation, about applying energy plus technology plus IP and ingenuity and being able to transport it to the front line. And that actually is your hard security advantage. There's not really a hard and soft, it's a hard and soft. Both of them go together. Equally, if we lower and have abundant energy costs, it actually allows us to have an advantage in AI and these other things, and reindustrialization and all the rest of it too. Equally, we saw in Syria with people fleeing a drought there, it creates the rise of far-right parties and misinformation from Russia and other things where they weaponize our communities around some of these things with the refugee problem. So the energy and climate is it's a double helix with hard security. I just wanted to sort of emphasize that. On the financing side, the question is also, to your point, it's about how much capital can you bring to solving some of these problems. And and in some of these areas, government and capital need to work together in a lot closer way. So in the 1940s and 50s, there was central planning from government, and then private markets worked around that. And then maybe in the 1950s and 60s, there was corporatism where the state and big companies worked together. In the 80s, government went out of fashion. The free markets should take care of this all, but it's led to deindustrialization, it's led to financialization, a bit of rent seeking. So now I think we're in a new paradigm where industrial policy is coming back, but it's a different kind of industrial policy. It's around risk sharing. It's around the government being an effective venture partner, working with people who want to put capital to risk. I'll give you a few examples, like hydrogen and other critical technologies. Some of those technologies are not at the stage where venture investors can invest in it. The amount of money for seed stage investors it's too much to get there. The amount of the timeline to where you can actually commercially sell hydrogen is probably more than the 6 to 8 years the most venture funds at a push are going to last for. You need government to be able to de-risk some of these things, whether it's taking on board technological risk, whether it's through things like blended finance approaches, whether it's clearing out some of the regulatory and other things to be able to get money to move so you can de-risk things. So when we look at projects, and I should say the Milken Institute, we have at our global conference, we have about $33 trillion worth of assets at our global conference. So a lot of our policy work is informed by bringing policymakers and those sources of capital together to solve various problems. And we identify problems really at 3 main levels. One is funding allowed to go into this area at all? So I used to chair a pension fund in the UK. A lot of the time we were not allowed to put money into something which had something to do with defense. Private capital wasn't allowed to invest in weapons. Now, or it would be defensive but not offensive weapons. Now, if you said, oh, should we only fund defensive weapons in Ukraine? They say, well, that's mad, because deterrence involves also being able to hit the other side and not just defense, right? So first of all, it's how can you eliminate some of the rules and other things at the funding level? Then it's getting the financing mechanisms right. Is whatever this investment is on the frontier of the best risk-return options that you have available? I could put lots of money into government debt, safe, 5% now or whatever, pretty good. Why should I put money into a drone company or a series of venture companies that may or may not? Defense, there's only really normally one customer. That doesn't tend to be a very good investment, right? So sometimes you need to take some risk off the table or boost returns if you want capital to flow into that area. And then the last thing is on the asset level itself. So how can you deregulate in certain ways? How can you give permissions for people to operate in certain ways? How can you bring together basic research and commercial opportunities to be able to exploit particular assets? So we look at how capital and policymakers can work together to rewrite the rules so that capital can work. And a final thought, because it's interesting, because you've got kind of 2 models, right? China is doing things at scale with government capital. Same with Russia. They have massive factories making one types of drones, and they're doing it at scale and very large. In Ukraine, you have a decentralized source of many different startups, many different venture funds. The problem is, can you make them interoperable? And can you scale the ones which are really, really good? And so there's pluses and minuses of both systems. And so what we need to do is we need to counteract the flaws of a decentralized capital-led system. But that means being a really good partner to the people who want to take the risk and want to put their money on the line. At the moment, if people are taking lots of risk, designing things, doing prototypes, and then government doesn't place the orders, that company will go out of business. So you need government to be there, understanding what are the incentives and the rules by which your partners are playing, and have a really partner-led approach to developing and scaling these capabilities. And at the moment in Europe, I feel like we're being too slow. I'll end with one example because I don't want to talk too long. The Europe Scale-Up Fund is a wonderful thing. And EQT is a wonderful investor, and I think it's a really great thing. It's 8 billion euros. One local government pension fund, one of 32 local boroughs, is 1.7 billion. I mean, the scale-up funding gap, that gap in the middle of the capital stack, is far bigger than 8 billion euros. So we need to have a savings investment union. We need to get going on that. That means some national governments doing things that are going to make them unpopular, to do pension reform. We need to find ways to lower energy costs and lower the fixed costs that all these companies face. And we need to get capital moving at scale intelligently to solve particular problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Fully agree. I would like to have a third round of questions that is a bit more prospective, and we will come back to this, continental security, and especially, it's often said that the Europeans should be more responsible for their security. Fair enough. We talked about this. What about the global stage? Can the Europeans manage both being more responsible for their own security and at the same time play a role that they at least talk about on the global stage?
Yeah, sure, it can, but it requires a complete mindset shift. And that is something that is quite difficult in Europe. We've become postmodern, so we don't do power politics anymore. We have to relearn that. We believe that what is happening within Europe also happens outside Europe. And we simply forgot that raw power politics are normal outside Europe. This is also, let's say, what happened because of the European Union. We organize mechanisms to deal with our problems in Brussels. And we simply cannot use the old mechanisms anymore outside the European Union. And that is really a big problem. So in the field of economics, we should change completely, but also in the field of defense. Can we do that? Yes, of course we can do that. If you look at the pile of documents produced by the European Commission, on economic affairs, from Letta to Draghi. Everything is there. If you look in the field of defense, everything is there. And that is, in a way, that is easy to do. We can do it. But what we should not do is ignore the state of the world, how it is changing, that it has become more transactional, that the world is a rougher place. We have to relearn that. And if we don't do that, then we're out of business. And there is, for example, a new report published by China which on global governance. Now, if you read it, it's fine. You will agree with everything. Because it's about cooperation, it's about win-win, and all the blah blah. That is European language, almost. Now, if this is true, why don't you put pressure on President Putin to stop this crazy war in Ukraine? So this is really problematic. So we in Europe should not look only outside, and Europe includes the European Union and the UK, but we should come up with an idea how to change Europe without giving up our values and become less blackmailable, because we are blackmailable in this part of Europe. We can do it. And then people say, well, it's expensive. But changing your defenses in Europe is not that expensive. It is not true that it costs €1 trillion and 10 to 20 years. No, you can do it quite rapidly, but then you have to work with Ukraine. Because drone defense, I was not long ago at the border of Belarus, and a couple of weeks ago I was in Ukraine. And if you look what they do there and how expensive it is, it's not expensive at all, so you can do it. But then we really should change, and then we should also say to the US, well, please step back. We do it on our own. Don't abandon NATO or say to the US, you should leave NATO. No, if you behave yourself, you're welcome to be back.
Yeah. If we continue, Omar, on the global stage and on the global architecture, if we put it simplistic, there are two camps. The guys that want the status quo, so basically Europeans, Westerners. We don't know if the US is still or not in this camp. It's a bit hybrid at the moment. And you would have, well, let's say these regional powers that are revisionists, right? They want to change, turn the tables, and do it differently. Why not? And then you have most of the countries on the global scene that are basically between the two camps and that are trying to balance and to have an attitude that is basically safeguarding your national interests. How is it perceived by Qatar, and how do you see this impacting the evolution of the global stage?
Okay, so just very briefly on the drone warfare, because it's and on the how Ukraine dumbed down the costs. So it's so we all thought that having the Shahids, the family of loitering munitions that Iran produced, and now Russia is reproducing as Garans. And if you go to Kiev in the middle of St. Sophia Square, you will find a version of it caught, and you can have a picture under it. And it's not very sophisticated, and it costs about, depending on the model, because it's an entire family, from $20,000 to $50,000. Okay, the Ukrainians are countering it in the lower bracket, so below the 10,000 feet bracket, with a counter drone, a counter UAV mechanism that is called, one of the versions, there are like over 20 now, but one of them called the Sting, and it costs 10% of the Shahid, so $2,000. So this is how expensive it is. It's not that expensive. And the drone technology in general is not that, it's not that advanced. Like, the US scored hits, US Navy scored hits on the Imperial Japanese Navy in the 1940s with a drone. It was actually part of the suppressing the Warsaw Uprising by the Wehrmacht was using the Goliath. The Goliath was a demolition vehicle, wire-guided. Today we call it an UGV, an unmanned, of course it's manned. I'll come to that. But it's called an unmanned ground vehicle. And of course it's manned because some types of drones, whether ground or air, they need 4 men or women to operate it. So actually it's very heavy in terms of labor, in terms of manpower use. So the T-72 tank, for example, the Soviet T-72 tanks require 3 men. So the crew is 3. So some types of drones require more than a 1970s technology in terms of the tanks. And this is what I told the Qataris, because the Qataris thought, oh, it's old technology, let's be Ukraine. To answer your question, and we'll be safe. We'll just do it like Ukraine. And my answer to them always was, you can't be Ukraine. If you can mobilize 20,000 men and women in 1 month, every month, for years, then you maybe can be Ukraine. If you have this kind of mobilization capacity, training capacity, arm them, train them, feed them, organize them, and have men with a lot of experience, because some of them have been fighting for over 10 years now, then you can be Ukraine. But at the moment, none in the Gulf can be Ukraine, and I would argue most Europe cannot be Ukraine. So they are in a league of their own at the moment, and that's why they're very important for NATO, probably as NATO, as they need NATO as well. In terms of Qatar. So the approach now is hedging. So why hedging? So basically we have the general trend is to keep good relations with the US specifically, even though the US looks as more of a disruptor of the international system as opposed to a guarantor of the international system at the moment. China looks more as in terms of its sustainability of the current system, in terms of revisionist power. It looks more as a power that wants to stabilize things as opposed to the US. But of course, it's in its interest to keep atterrating its adversaries, which is us, the West and the US and Europe. Hence the issue of Ukraine. For the Qataris, I think the alliance with the US will continue. I think they are going towards further armaments, which is the entire Gulf is doing so now. But also in terms of hedging, all of the Gulf, including the UAE, are now using this unilateral diplomacy with Iran. Mainly because they realize how tough is Iran and how vulnerable they are.
Yeah.
So in that sense, they are compromising on that dimension. So it's hedging, basically.
Perfect, thank you very much. I want to bring back the topic of climate change and also a bit more about soft security, because I think this is something that we started to talk about and which is very important. It's about how do you basically make sure that, we said, climate change is urgent, right? So this is very needed. We need to take actions, all these things. The problem with urgency is that generally we take very short-term decisions. So how do we put long-term into our architecture today?
Yeah, thank you, Romain. Yeah, there is an emergency, and I think the scientists are super clear on the emergency to act in relation to not only climate but biodiversity as well. We see a collapse of biodiversity that is very, very fast. And the issue we face is that compared to, peacekeeping and so on, we have the false feeling, confidence that we can address climate and biodiversity degradation in a second phase. But the issue that we have is once the temperature rises, once biodiversity collapses, we enter uncharted territories because effects are cumulative. And we don't really know where we're going with the extreme weather events, cumulating, and it affects production means, it affects food security, it affects our everyday life. And so there is an emergency. And the emergency is related to the fact that in any case, we need to put ourselves on a trajectory towards decreasing emissions, for example, towards regenerating biodiversity. Because decreasing emissions is not going to happen from one day to the other. We need to change the infrastructure. We need to change the economic structure. And this all takes time. So, to answer your question, we have to do it at the same time that we actually address our peacekeeping and military security. We can't sequence and say we will come after, because it will be too late. But again, we have the instruments for that. The Paris Agreement, the targets, they were all to give us this long-term perspective and the sense of a trajectory and not of a move from one day to the other. And so we have the instruments. Now we have to be confident that we can address several priorities at the same time and not only one, and that we have to mainstream the climate dimension, the biodiversity dimension in every action that we are taking today, including when we look to securing our security, military security.
Thank you, Simon. And this is the last, because I think that we are almost over time. Yes. The last question is basically bringing a second tension there. And this is the tension between, global challenges that we're facing, but also localization of the decision making. And so how basically, especially at times of populism, we talked about democratic security just a bit, but how do you basically guarantee that our policymakers can act and not be pressured by the local electorates, or just basically favoring short-term, localized, self-interested decisions when we need to act globally? And basically, how can we make international cooperation today in those conditions?
Great question. I mean, I think, how do I say this? I don't think we should try and inoculate decisions from the will of the people who we're meant to be representing. We're meant to be trying to, I think, better align them. And so the question is, how do you do that? I think we have an opportunity here in terms of explaining much better than we're doing the nature of the threat. So I think Munich Security Conference maybe 2 years ago, they said, hands up who thinks their country is at war, and almost everyone put their hands up. And they said, who here thinks the people in their country think that they're at war? And hardly anyone put their hands up, right? And we might not be, whether we're at war, there's certainly, we've talked about climate, we've talked about national security, we've talked about the sense of urgency. People don't necessarily have that sense of urgency. So when we're asking people to sacrifice and they don't know what we're asking them to sacrifice for, you're going to get a backlash. So we need to focus some minds. I think we also need to realize that doing the same thing and insisting that the people have got it wrong, let's dissolve the people and elect another, in the words of Bertolt Brecht, isn't necessarily the way to go either, right? So, for example, Brexit is obviously something close to my heart. I think we need to think about a more generous approach to this. We might need to have a monetary euro, we might need to think about a free trade Europe and a defense Europe. We need to think, how do we bring Ukraine and the United Kingdom into a larger sense of the European system? And that might be, I'll give you a sense too. If we're trying to, Europe has a choice about whether it's a buyer or a builder of these critical technologies of the future. And if it wants to have digital sovereignty, it can buy, if it wants, really second-class or third-class European versions, unless it creates first-class versions. And we tried import substitution in Latin America in the 70s, and it didn't end up very good for Latin America. So how do we join together to build that second type of economy, that next industrial revolution, on those technologies that really matter? And it's going to need to have a much more European joined-up approach, but one that focuses on how it can change people's lives and increase, the better the climate they're living in, increase the money in their pocket, their sense of security, resilience. Because competitiveness and resilience are really two sides of the same coin. And I'll end with a final thought, because you said very kindly that we're running out of time, and I don't want... So I will be quick, very quick. Which is, Europe was founded on this idea of functionalism, right? The steel and community. At the moment, we have these primes that, Jens Stoltenberg lost an election, very popular man, because he bought frigates from the United Kingdom when all the Norwegians said, but we build ships, what are you doing? With AI, with quantum, with whatever it might be, we have a choice of whether we take a national solution or whether we have a European solution. The total addressable market of Europe makes it much more attractive for entrepreneurs. If we bring European capital to bear, that's a lot more likely that we win the race. We also have really, really great IP and great research in the United Kingdom, in Switzerland, in other areas. If we take this larger European approach, we need to think of how do we redesign ourselves, and how do we think about how do we create the national architecture and the European architecture, not just the global architecture, if we're going to win the economy, the national security, and the climate that we deserve for the next 20, 30 years.
Thank you. And I suggest that on this great call for European cooperation for better solutions at the global scale, we will close. I will say thank you to the organizers for this possibility of organizing this roundtable. I think it was a brilliant discussion. Thank you to the audience to stay there until that late, because it's quite hot and warm. So happy that you will still be there. And finally, let me please join me to thank our speakers for this brilliant discussion. Thank you very much.